Would you do if you fell asleep in a cave and woke up in a completely different world with strange beasts and people you could talk to, but who were different from you and had ancient empires and lost customs and a failed civilization? It would be like going through the looking glass or waking up now. Where are we in this world of myth and adventure and terror? Well, today on the Mosaic Ark, we have a very special guest come to us from Mars to help us understand the meaning of myth and enchantment. Welcome to the Mosaic Ark. We're on Mars. Look, we're on Mars. Can you believe that? What are we doing here? We are now here live on Mars, and our very handsome guest with his dog. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Rachel. It's good to be here.
So you are a mystery. I mean, you're a mystery enough to me that I had to like go watch the movie this past weekend because I had never seen John Carter, and I the thing is that though I was intrigued enough, I realized simply by the premise of Postcards from Barsoom, which is your Substack, to start reading you several months ago, and I'm really happy and honored that you're willing to come talk to us ladies about the writing that you've been doing. But I want to start with like why John Carter and From Mars and Barsoom. And I know you said it's just because you like the story, but I it's got to be deeper than that.
Yeah, it's like one of those questions, like, writers, yeah, why did you give this name to that character? Like and the answer, it's always the same, like, depressing, shallow answer on a whim. Uh, I need,
On a whim, I came up with it. It
so
just seemed right. Well,
yeah, no, exactly. Like when I started my Substack, like two and a half years ago now, I didn't want to write under my own name. So I was like, I need a handle. What should I go with? And it just popped into my head. Like, why not? I mean, by I've always been fascinated by the sort of John Carter, Edgar Rice Burroughs mythos, because it sort of like predates science fiction and fantasy as distinct genres.
right.
It actually underlies a lot of the sort of American mythology that develops in the 20th century. Like, he's actually the basis for Superman. The whole idea of the green-skinned Martian kind of comes from that. Um,
Okay,
uh,
so trust me. Assume our audience doesn't know any of this. Tell us a little bit more about it because I recognize I've watched the movie now, and everything you're saying makes sense to
mhm.
me. That it is like the story for so much of our fantasy and sci-fi, and yet I hadn't. I mean, you were stunned when I said I hadn't read it, or I mean, I knew it existed, right? And I was aware of Tarzan and stuff like that. But it's interesting to me that and again, like looking for, illustrations to have our discussion today, I found like, wow, there's loads of comic books, there's loads of book covers.
Hmm.
There's like, how have I never
Hmm.
heard of John Carter? It was sort of funny to me.
I was
Yeah.
actually so I was actually a little bit surprised after I started writing the number of people who were like, "Oh my god, that's like my favorite thing." I was like, "Really?" I thought it was actually pretty obscure um, myself, and it's nowhere near as well known as like Tarzan, for example, or Conan the Barbarian. Uh, but it turned out that there were quite a few people who knew the mythology, knew the books, pretty well. So, I mean, the basic story is that this Virginian cavalryman, John Carter, is out panning for gold kind of after the Civil War has ended, gets attacked by Indians, takes shelter in a cave, which turns out to be a mystical cave, uh, goes falls asleep and then wakes up on Mars. And from there he has adventures. Battles green-skinned, four-armed barbarians, saves this. I think the original space princess Stasia Forus, and like ends up becoming like the warlord of the planet essentially. Um, and he ends up with, because he's on Mars, which has lower gravity, he's able to jump really far, and he's very
Superman.
strong compared to the natives.
Yeah.
This is exactly what it's. You see, like the Superman thing, kind of like turned it around, right? Like instead of being a human going to the world, it's an
Right.
alien coming to our planet, and then they did the weird thing with like
So
it was because of a red sun or something instead of higher gravity, which doesn't really make sense. But comic book writers usually get a little confused on actual scientific concepts.
Details.
Yeah. But no, I find like my readers, my interlocutors frequently have more fun with the John Carter thing than I do. For me, it's really just kind of like that's the name I write under, and it sometimes influences the choice of art that I'll throw into my articles to spice them up. But it has nothing whatsoever to do with the actual subject matter.
I'm going to convince you by the end of this stream that it does.
I think it does. Like I immediately thought, yeah, it does.
We needed to bring you in to explain to you how poetic your choice of character was. So Burroughs wrote, I then, doing my historian thing, looking up stuff that a lot of what he put, John Carter was his first story, and he was putting in things that were to a certain extent from his own life, right? That he did have experience out in the West. He was from Chicago, right? And it's interesting to me that he's writing. John Carter comes out in 1917, right, which is a big, like, talk about mythological moment for our story, and that he's doing it between in the story between the Civil War and the current war that he's actually in. I am now, I'm grateful to you for nothing else, and like making me go pay attention to it, because it's not just that it's behind so much of our mythology. It's like it's in tandem with the very things that I think you're actually writing about in your Substack about history and science and such. And so it's this weird shadow, like you're behind the scenes for us talking to us, this shadow presence for a good deal of 20th century sort of self perception, which I found very interesting. Okay, so if you're, well, then the other thing, it's like I've started reading the book, right? I got the book with the cover that you use as your avatar. Frazetta, nice. Right? Is a I grew up with
famous Frank
these pictures in a sense, because he was all over the fantasy calendars that I had in the 70s, right? So I knew that style of art, but obviously not the characters. And that's another kind of thing, that Carter is somehow the space barbarian with the princess and the bikini, which is obviously them behind
Princess
Star
Leia.
Wars and everything. Yeah, it's like this
Right.
is
exactly.
clearly what
Precisely.
Leia is in the character. But so in our in-depth research, we all watched the movie. And I asked you what you thought about the movie, and you said, "Don't get me started," so I'm going to get you started. Your response to the movie and like what it's done. We were talking before we started before we started streaming about how you were happy that it hadn't become more popular than it did. I mean, it's 2012 Disney and did not make it out of the first story, right? They didn't end up making a series, which we're actually now grateful
It
for.
totally bombed the box
Totally
office.
bombed.
I've heard a theory that that's literally just because of how they marketed it, how they titled it. So instead of calling it John Carter of Mars
Right.
or A Princess of Mars, the original title of the book, they just called it John
So
Carter.
nobody
which
knew
is
what it was.
really
Yeah.
Yeah.
right, exactly, right, yeah. And the character himself has been like largely forgotten by pop culture. There's nothing in the title to tell you why you would want to watch this. And maybe that's why. Maybe it was just bad marketing. I don't know, but it totally bombed the box office to not make back the money they spent on it. Very high budget film. So that was it. No sequel was ever made, and thank God, because if they had, they would have emasculated the character. They would have, shoved him out of the way to put a female character in his place, or they would have made him gay, or like I don't know. They would have done something terrible.
Well, they would have remarketed as A Princess of Mars, and he would have been a secondary character, and she would have. It would have been a real story, because that's the way they went.
The third book or fourth book in the series, because he wrote a bunch of them. It was like Tulia, Maid of Mars, which actually did have a female protagonist. So they could easily have just kind of like, evolved following
would have been enough.
ERB. Yeah, you would think, but like, there have been other cases in pop culture where there's no reason for them to force insert diversity because it was already there in the original.
They're green,
but they went ahead and did it anyway.
Right? They did it in reverse with Doctor Strange, right? The ancient one was supposed to be an Asian man. They made him a Scottish woman. It was just, it's like, but it's already built in. Why would you do that?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
Well, that's
Bernard
what's
Cornwell's,
so funny about with Burroughs and John Carter. I mean, he's writing in 1917. The Green Martian guys are clearly Apaches, right? Because
they're supposed to be Apaches.
Well, he falls asleep in an Arizona cave,
Indians.
Right, and being chased by Apache Indians, and he wakes up.
Yes.
Well, no, he wakes up, realizes he can. Okay, this was some. There were some things in the movie that was different. That I'm sort of, if we wanted to do like, which I kind of do, but an in-depth comparison between the movie version and the book version. There were mechanisms in the movie that are not in the book, like that he has to have an amulet that helps him transport, right? There's a tech device.
There's no explanation really in the book for how he does it. It's just like, he was in the right spot and he falls asleep and he dreams his way to Mars,
Right.
There's very much a subtext of like, it could all have just been a dream. It's all in his mind,
Well, it's a kind of Alice in Wonderland, right? It's like, how did he get there? And
well, it's an isekai.
Okay, yeah,
Well,
you did a post, you did an opening post in your Substack about that.
Yeah.
What's an isekai?
An isekai is a Japanese genre, basically where a character from our world finds themselves in some alien world. It could be a dream world, it could be another planet. They walk through a portal and suddenly here they are. And usually it turns out that they have some kind of special power there, or they have talents from our world that end up being extremely special in that world. And they become rather crucial to solving a problem in that world. This is a very common genre in Japanese anime. But I think A Princess of Mars might have been one of the first sort of like fictional treatments of that use that trope.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say for sure. I mean, like obviously like fairy stories and stuff like that, where you go into like into the Seelie realms or the Fey realms, or it's not quite the same.
Well, but it is like that. He basically falls asleep in an underground. I mean, the fairy stories are always, they go into a mound and I haven't read far enough, but in the movie at least there's a problem of like exactly how long he's gone and then I assume he gets back to Mars because there's more stories, but how long he's been away from Mars when he finally he manages to get himself back. It seems like you're right. I hadn't thought of that. It's actually classic fairy problem that he goes and finds a princess and marries the fairy princess.
Right.
This is
And
what I
then
meant when
time
I,
has no
it's
meaning there, right? And then when he comes back, it's like everybody's dead or no time has passed at all. And then when he goes
Right.
back, it's been centuries. That was an Irish
right.
mythology too, with Tirnanog, that goes way back.
Well, there's
Yeah.
some indication of this in the book. It's like he's got like in the introduction to it, Edgar Rice Burroughs is like his nephew or something, and is responsible for publishing his memoir and managing his fortune or something like that. And I think he remarks, that when he showed up, like when the John Carter character shows up, he's like, doesn't seem to have aged a day. It's like,
Right.
it's like
Yes.
he's,
definitely fairy
despite
time.
not having seen him for like 10 years or something like that. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Right. No
And,
time has passed.
yeah, it sort of gets at that at the book predating the division between sci-fi and fantasy, because like a lot of it's just sort of it's magic, like it just happened. But then there's other things that are sort of where he actually was thinking through some of the actual scientific implications, like the fact that Mars has lower gravity, the fact that it has 2 moons, which kind of plays a little bit of a role. At one point he has to break into like an atmospheric factory, which is keeping the planet from drying out and dying, and which has been damaged or sabotaged somehow. So like, if he doesn't fix it, like in the end, I think he almost asphyxiates as a result of that. So there's aspects that like where he's obviously sort of like, he's drawing on everything that's sort of like in the zeitgeist and just kind of like letting it flow through without worrying too much about it. Right.
What's really poignant about this is he dreams himself to Mars, right? Because these science fiction stories where he was absorbing all of the known knowledge about these things and speculating about it, fed into a fiction, would fetch somebody else's imagination, and they just kept adding to it until somebody someday said, no, we're really going to go to the moon here. We're going to go shoot some rockets in outer space with some people.
We're going to use a rocket.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
It's like the imagination feeds the science, feeds the imagination, and so on.
Yes.
It's like this well-oiled machine.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's sort of like the idea of a hyperstition. Right. Which I think Nick Land was the one who came up with this concept, which is a belief, which is, or like a dream almost. It's not true, but it makes itself true.
Yeah.
In time.
Right. It's almost like a fake until you make it, even if you're only faking it up here, right? Until you can find or create the technology to actually make your dreams come true. You can dream yourself to Mars, in other words.
Well, so this is then what you actually write about on your Substack, which is thinking about the way in which this kind of process works. And so now we'll have to do the serious part of the conversation so that we unpack all of it. You showed us a book length essay that you wrote on the reenchantment of the world, and yes, one, and
thank you.
Casey's actually read it really carefully and has some questions for you. So if we could go to that. And
oh God,
we are a full seminar version of streaming here. You don't get off easy. You thought it was just going to be tea with the ladies, right? No. This is why I wanted to talk to you, because your project on your Substack is very similar to what we've been working with on the Mosaic Ark and in our poetry writing, which is this sense of what kind of mythology are we living in right now? What is its relationship to history and reality? And the kinds of things you said you do and don't do in the Substack, you had a long list of, well, is it culture? Is it science? Is it politics? Is it tech? Is it yes? And all of that, and that is with our Mosaic Ark really one of our points, right? It's like you're looking for the pieces of this reality that are shattered in all of these different directions. And I like that you brought in that reenchantment article, this like we're getting to the place where we're yearning for some kind of reenchantment, but how do we get here? And if we could if you could sort of talk us through that, and Casey, you had some questions to help us get through the points of his argument there.
Well, he just brought up hyperstition. I think we already discussed that a bit. I see it. I've never heard that word before. I've seen it everywhere though. Well, in obviously in the space race, but maybe in other things too, like AI and yeah, like a magic talking rock. How weird is that? You know?
In a very general sense, it gets down to the interaction between intentionality, imagination, and reality, which does not even necessarily have to involve technology. Like, so an example I use, I think, in the article is like, you know, you're hungry and you decide you will get an apple. Well, you don't have an apple right now. You're imagining yourself holding an apple and taking a bite of it, right? And then because you kind of hold that idea of I would like to eat an apple in your mind, you get up and you walk over and you pick up an apple and you start eating it. This is a very simple thing, right? But like it's like, you know, reality is not a certain way. You see in your imagination a way that you would like reality to be, and then you take steps to move towards changing reality to match what is in your imagination. And you know, with technological development, things like artificial intelligence or nuclear power or rocketry, powered flights, you know, all of these really things that would have been considered sorcery not that long ago, that we sort of dreamed about, like, what if we could, like, you know, fly with the birds, right? And we just kind of had this vague sort of idea that would sort of kick around in our folklore and the stories that we would tell for, you know, thousands and thousands of years as just like a dream. And then eventually we figure out how to make that real. Because obviously some dreams are much more like the distance between the current configuration of reality and you know, the place that you want to get to is very vast. So it's not as simple as standing up and walking across the room to get an apple, right? Like it takes millions of people working over thousands of years in order to make it real.
And weirdly
but
enough,
you still got it.
Yeah, Werner von Braun actually saw this coming, right? And he created a fictional book and cartoons to actually introduce kids to the idea of exploring space.
It goes back further. So the Russian cosmist Tsiolkovsky, back in the 19th century, who was actually inspired by some very weird theology. I think if you haven't looked into Tsiolkovsky, I think you ladies would find him a fascinating character.
I would write about him, so I find it.
Yeah, so he was the one who really got the ball rolling on this stuff on space. I mean, back in the, like I said, the late 19th century. He didn't build anything himself, but he sort of had all of the key ideas that we've been using ever since. So multi-stage rockets, airlocks, spacesuits, even like rotating space stations for artificial gravity via the centrifugal force, which we haven't actually done that yet. Like that's sort of, you know, that's an idea that's like so pervasive in sci-fi that, like, you know, sometimes we almost assume that we have done it, right? So obviously we're gonna do that. But that all came from Tsiolkovsky's. That came from Tsiolkovsky's, you know, imagination. He worked out like all the mathematics behind it.
So he sounds a bit like Da Vinci.
Yeah, you could say that. Maybe not that level of a polymath. He also came up with the Tsiolkovsky rocket equation, which is, like, you know, key to rocket science, obviously.
So what I hear in all of this is, one, subcreation and you know, just imagination. And it's interesting that we have, I mean, hyperstition is, for me, that sounds to me like a relabeling of something that used to be called creativity. And it's interesting that I think, you know, one of the things about your reenchantment argument is how we feel like drained of creativity and sort of, you know, depressed and in this cycle. You have a lot of great phrases in your writing, this miasma of cultural despair. Whereas I mean, we're talking fairy stories now. We can talk about like simply art, right? It's like I have an image of a thing that I want to make, and then I work to, you know, with technology to manifest that into the world. I mean, that's simply art. And it's wild that we have this now. Is this like, oh wow, yeah, that's sci-fi. We could never do all of it. Technology being a you know, a form of art as well. The opposite direction, I think we in the Mosaic Ark talk a lot about Marshall McLuhan's understanding
Mhm.
of the effects of technology, and that sort of feeling that the idea for the thing comes to multiple people before it actually happens. He says that's coming out of, artists' sensitivities to things coming from the future, in effect, right? There's this kind of like, as historians, we often have a difficulty of saying, well, who invented that? Like there were all these ideas around and suddenly it was there. And there is,
And there's an idea in the ether, and like
yeah,
you see this happen in the history of science all the time, where like multiple people will have basically the same idea simultaneously. I've seen this happen on Substack numerous times, where like
How
out
does
of
that
out
happen?
of out of nowhere, you'll have like 3 or 4 or 5 writers within a short period of time will put out articles on basically the same
yep,
topic, and not on topical things, right? If it's current events, obviously, oh, Trump got assassinated, everyone's writing about Trump, the assassination attempt,
right.
right? Which I did too, because of course. But
It's a disturbance in the force. Of
when
course,
it's
we all
like,
talked about it.
right,
Yeah,
exactly. But it's
exactly.
really more of a. What's more interesting is when it's like it's like some kind of like abstract, metaphysical, philosophical kind of question, and several people independently decide, oh, I'm going to write about this right now, right? And it's almost like the idea is kind of out there in the ether, and people are just kind of like tapping into
Right.
this. Yeah.
So then then it becomes this huge question of like where ideas come from, where does our inspiration come from, how do we invent?
Mhm.
And so there's a like a whole philosophy of, I mean,
What is the nature of consciousness?
yes, yes,
Yeah.
Is it something which is generated from inside the brain through some kind of chemical calculation process, or is it a wave that your brain kind of tunes into like an antenna? Or I mean, my
That
favorite
seems more
metaphor.
likely.
Yeah,
Because how,
but it's
how
a
else are the people coming up with same ideas in different continents, before the age of any kind of mass communication?
my
How
only
does
issue with
that?
that particular metaphor, and it was I got this from Ian McGilchrist actually, who is a really fascinating neuroscientist, and he pointed out that that's actually that the antenna metaphor is actually a dualist metaphor, which you run into issues with the free will question, actually, because what's really is it you? Is it
where is it coming from?
or
Yeah,
are you
yeah,
just
yeah.
like are you just a
Well,
robot
you
which is
could
being
reject it.
driven by this wave? So he has a sort of tertiary metaphor, and I had an essay talking with this permittivity of free thought that I wrote like maybe a year and a half ago, and in that one, it's more that like consciousness is it's our brains are like filters basically. So if you think about consciousness as light, um, then your brain is kind of like like a grating or a prism that breaks that light up, or that selects out one particular wavelength, um,
That
which I
sounds
think
so
works
medieval.
pretty
I love
well.
it. Right.
Oh,
You've
totally,
just
absolutely,
described a
right,
rose
right, right.
window with, the sort of the
Yes,
light streaming into the
precisely.
cathedral and filled with
Yes,
joy. That's beautiful. Yes.
exactly, right. And you can modify that a little bit too, because there's the question. And it's kind of like the reciprocal question of what is consciousness, is what is matter, what is energy. And of course, the monist answer is it's all kind of the same thing. There's just different aspects of the same thing, right? Like matter is like crystallized consciousness. So the metaphor that I kind of came up with was like, okay, imagine like a river flowing through a landscape made of ice, right? So it's all the same substance. The ice, the river, all water, right? But some of it's solid, some of it's liquid. The water running through the riverbed carves the riverbed, changes its shape, right? But at the same time, the shape of the riverbed is guiding the water.
Hmm.
Uh, it's a reciprocal process. And in the same fashion, like you have a habit and you find you do things all the time, right? Like that's like the shape of the physical shape of your brain is like affecting the way that consciousness expresses itself through you. But the thoughts that you have will also change the shape of your brain.
Right.
It's not a one-way thing.
Hmm.
My dog gets trapped
That's
under my
interesting.
desk.
So imprinting happens on the brain. That's a powerful thought.
Well, again, these things are old ideas, and it's interesting that they feel, I mean, it's wonderful that they feel fresh and new, again, that people are puzzling with them, but the sense of our ability to create and our embeddedness in the world seem to be something that people are finding both. Well, I want to go back to the despair, right? You're being too happy. Because
like the opening part of that essay, down in
it's
the
really
necrocosm, I
grim.
think I called
We
it.
need to do the grim. We actually, so we have a variety of comments in our site. Welcome Hans and I. Hi. He says, I love how
Hey, Hans.
women and men think differently. This is a great conversation. We aim to please. We will be the princesses to his hero. Okay, they're talking about some other stuff with Mel right now. We need before we find the happy solution to how we make new mythology, we need to go through some of the reason that it's feeling so dire, right? The dark ages that we're in, which I of course don't believe exist, right? But the sort of problem of why we're obviously enjoying in this conversation the ability to say, yes, we live in this light-filled universe of joy and beauty. Why is everyone so depressed?
I mean, the short answer is we killed God.
Oh, well.
Like Nietzsche said back, like
yeah,
like which is like shorthand for like disenchanting the world, right? It's like you've taken all of the magic in it. You've drained life and mind out of a world in which you, in a more naive, childlike state, we sort of like naturally just assume that the world is like that. That the sun is alive, that the rocks are alive, that everything has its kind of spirit to it, right? So you're in this kind of like living, breathing universe, and then we kind of said, well, no, we're not. We're in a dead universe, and maybe some things are sort of conditionally alive, but
I'm not sure a lot of people think anything's alive, right?
Exactly. That's the point.
Transhumanists who want to transport themselves into computers and what, right? It's like
because the world's a simulation, right? This is the current thought. But
which is this weird corruption of the idea of like the world as being a dream in the mind of God or something. But so that's you hit on precisely the issue, actually. Once you withdraw consciousness as being a basic property of the universe, then it becomes conditional and in anything. And you can very easily then just go completely the other direction and say, well, everything is actually dead fundamentally. Like even living creatures are just machines, right?
What rights have machines got? Right, it can get really ugly really fast.
And it did.
Yeah.
If you look at the history of the 20th century, it did get extremely ugly. And I don't think we're out of the woods yet.
That's why the before and after of the John Carter book versus the movie is interesting, because it's bookending that problem, right, from the World War I to now, and now that we've posed the question, Nietzsche didn't do it. Nietzsche was observing.
No.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like he was saying God's dead and we killed him, and that's really bad. What's going to happen now?
Yes, he was not happy about it at all. He was like, this is a catastrophe. Like
nobody ever mentions that part. They just think, oh yeah, it was declared God was dead. So now everybody believes it, right?
Right.
And isn't it cruel and philosophical to claim God is dead, and Nietzsche, and then we get the blah blah blah, and that's what it seems to me that you've been doing both in the reenchantment of the world and also the World War II myth that you're writing about Iliada, that how do you kill a myth? This is I've never thought about it exactly this way until just now. It's like, yes, people have fallen away in doubt and loss of faith, and just this week, yesterday, First Things published another another article on, everybody's starting to wake up to the reality that World War II is like haunting us mythologically, and that has created this horror for us. But to a great extent, it was already happening before World War II.
No, World War II is the zombie of World War One. It's still walking around, and it's still affecting us.
So I would sort of say that like World War One was the war. You could say that's the war where God died in the public mind, right? Like, Nietzsche, a generation or so before that, he sort of says, he's like, he's very deeply embedded in like the intellectual culture of Europe. And he's like, oh, God's dead now, right? But
he sees
that
it
hasn't
coming.
yet
He's
filtered
one of
down.
these. He's seen it.
He sees it coming, exactly, right? He's exactly. That hasn't filtered down to the level of like the individual, peasant, right? Most people were still going to church and still believed in Jesus and everything. And World War One happens, and it's just this. It's a complete atrocity on all sides. Like huge numbers of people die for no good reason that anyone can tell. It doesn't just kind of kill God in people's minds. I mean, it does that because everyone's kind of like, how could a benevolent deity do this, right? Allow this to happen. It also kills European civilization, actually. Like the sort of the whole notion of having a warrior aristocracy of
right. The warrior aristocracy is
divine
the thing that
kingship of.
It's the empires,
and they actually were
destroying each other.
And they were some of the first victims of it.
Right.
Actually. I mean, the casualty rates amongst the officer class were higher than they were amongst the enlisted soldiers, which people frequently forget that. So I mean, like Europe lost the flower of its youth. The aristocracy got gutted.
It sounds like they were committing suicide, but why? Why would they do that?
Well, right, because God was dead, actually, right? But they hadn't really quite clicked with them yet. But like you were already in a society, in a civilization that was operating on these kinds of very mechanistic managerial principles, but the consequences of that hadn't really filtered down for people yet.
Yeah.
And okay, so then that happens. Everyone's walking around in shock for like a decade after World War One, right? You just have to look at the art of the time, the poetry. Look at like T.S. Eliot, for example, The Wasteland, the rise of modernism. It's just a very bleak time in a lot of ways. And at the same time, you have this sort of Nietzschean, Faustian sort of reaction to that, almost like a code. Right. This is where the idea of the overman really gets embraced by the progressives at the time, who are more like, in many ways, more right-wing progressives than the left-wing progressives that we think of now. And they were all about eugenics, for example. And, we're going to use science to improve humanity, and even the communists, they were like, we're going to do like scientific socialism.
Oh yeah,
right?
Communists. This is what people. I've been trying to convince people of this, that capitalism, communism are these Girardian twins that we've been talking about a lot here. That they're both love machines.
Yeah.
Right. It's like they're the
Yes.
twins of the machines. That the communist ideal was make enough. It's like it's the one that everybody wants their own robot. Right. It's make enough machines so that people can all be poets. I mean, they literally say that in the ABC of Communism, that they want. It's an industrial vision. They're destroying the farm world. The kulaks that the Soviets murder.
They're just capitalism and communism are just arguments over how best to manage an industrial democracy.
Exactly. But they're both completely they're brothers of each other. It's brother twins.
This is why fascism is the sort of redheaded stepchild of 20th century political theory, because a lot of one should say fascism, because it's not like there was one ideology there during the time, but a lot of them were explicitly rejecting that sort of mechanistic view of man and the reduction of man to Homo economicus. They could be very authoritarian, for sure, but there's a strong strain of romanticism. Like the Iron Guard in Romania, for example, were very, very religious. So it's probably not accidental that liberalism, basically capitalism, and communism, like both kind of like teamed up to, take out the fascist insurgency in Europe during that time. And then, okay, so World War II. So like World War II, that wasn't the war that killed God. That was the war that built the new myth.
Right.
That
Right.
that because there was no real myth that came out of the Great War, right? That was just a trauma, and then like people just didn't know how to process that. And then World War II was like the sort of the completion of that story arc, essentially, that led to everything that we have now.
Which people are starting to, I mean, the myth is breaking because people are starting to,
people are noticing. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think, so people have like noticed that it's mythic for a long time. I think a lot of it's just economic, frankly. People are like, the system that was built at the end of the Second World War is breaking down. It's not working for a large number of people, and has become suicidal, actually, if you take some of the moral imperatives that were set during that time and you apply them with ruthless logic, and sort of push out another generation, then Western civilization stops existing. The immigration issue is the biggest one.
It died a while ago. And what I mean, this is what you're trying to find in your reenchantment thing is like the old world is dying. What is the new world? And I'm still now trapped in the thought that I have. It's like exactly like Nietzsche has seen something coming, but it's already happening, which is why he's able to say it. Now I'm like, exactly why did God die? and I have historians' versions of things about how the scholarship is historicizing the myth that they had, which was Christ, right? And doing all of this work in like the German liberal Protestant theologians dealing with the degree to which Jesus is a historical figure and therefore demythologizing his role. But that again, I don't feel this is the sort of cause and effect, that a degree to which we as writers or storytellers can make myth. I don't know where that's coming from. I don't know that we can do that. Casey?
How do you explain to people, because this is hard for me to wrap my head around too. The word itself, myth, its definition means to most people false. Somebody made it up. So when people say you want to demythologize Christ, does that mean that they considered Christ to be a made up person and they wanted to prove that no, he was really a historical person? And does that apply also to things like the narratives surrounding the Second World War or even the First World War or any major event?
So I
touched on.
Let me just say that's exactly what they do in the mid-19th century with Jesus. To say first, David Friedrich Strauss with his the Life of Christ critically examined shows that the Gospels won't work as historical sources because they're all into like writing historical truth. That they don't work as historical sources because they have these factual inconsistencies, so you can't even date things with them. And how is this character even consistent? Because there's these different stories about him. And then there's a sort of flip side of that with like Ernst Renan, who wants to make Jesus more like real, psychologically realistic. So what would it have been like for this man in who came from Nazareth to have this mythology grow up around him? And would he not be like Renan kind of, he sort of sees him as like going nuts, right? Because
that's where you get the Last Temptation of Christ and movies like that, right? From that line of thought.
It's like there was a real person, but he's actually so laden with everybody's mythological expectations that he believes it, right? So he's going crazy.
This is also you see the same kind of thing that people will do when they kind of deconstruct heroes,
right?
Like historical personages, right? Where it's like, oh, well, actually, he was just like a regular guy, and he only went and Cortez only went and conquered Mexico because his dad was mean to him on Christmas morning when he was a
Yes,
kid or
exactly.
something, right? Like,
Oh, good grief.
First,
right,
he didn't
like,
exist. No,
exactly.
actually, he was just
Yeah.
ordinary.
It's emasculating
And of
him.
course, if we do that with certain figures, for example, Adolf Hitler, now that's very, very dangerous, because I think in your discussion of the myth of World War II, it's like you can't question you. It's like, because I think they can see it coming, right? It's like, well, wait a minute, if he's no longer the embodiment of evil, but he had context. It's the same thing that happened with Jesus in the Life of Jesus stories.
Yes.
But that's
Exactly.
a religion.
Yes.
It's a
Yes.
religion, not a myth.
No, but it is 100% a religion. There's spicy names. I won't repeat because this goes on YouTube. There's spicy names that have been given to the World War II religion, but I mean, it's sort of this dark parody of Christianity with
I can see that.
an entire people projected into the suffering of Christ, but without really having a redemption at the end. And instead, the central place is taken by the devil figure. Like there's no real
Lucifer
redemption,
the main character
right?
of the story.
Yeah, it's an
Yes.
inversion.
Yeah, exactly. It kind of inverts the entire thing. And you do see in certain parts of the internet, right? There's been a tendency, kind of a perennial tendency, really going back decades, and it kind of comes and goes. The internet, right, doesn't go back decades, but you know what I mean. Where they just take that myth and they invert it, right? So if Hitler was a devil, well, the current order sucks, so therefore Hitler must have actually been Satan, right? And he's a tragic hero.
That's the temptation, just to flip them over. But that's like capitalism, communism flipping each other. You're still in that same dynamic.
Right. You're still trapped in the same thing. Exactly. Right. And it's actually very similar to like what, like literal Satanists do, right? Where like, they often start out as kind of like, oh, I want to escape like the strictures of Christianity. So I'll just turn the cross upside down and worship the devil instead of God. And exactly. Right. And I'll say the Lord's Prayer backwards or, whatever. But they're still inside that system. Right? Like they haven't actually escaped the system. They just have decided to.
It defines them.
Right. Yes.
Okay. So Casey, we still have to answer Casey's question about myth, which I interrupted to do my little history thing.
Oh, right.
And then,
yes.
and then I have two options here. It's like these are inversions within the same system, or Christianity's just true, which is where we go to. Right. And so it's like you're saying that the reality is this light-filled world of joy and and of a benevolent creator that we participate in, who came to save us, right? And so but let's talk about the definition of myth, because I think in your reenchantment piece you're wrestling at a lot of different levels with defining that, and maybe people talk about the mythos and logos first and then work from there.
Yeah, so I mean those are Greek terms, obviously. If you trace back the actual usage of mythos, it wasn't at all actually what, in the modern sense of like a fake story, right? Like it actually meant like a story that you heard kind of through word of mouth, but it carried a connotation of, there's truth to this. It's something you should listen to. And in fact, it was used as to refer to a form of speech as well as like a body of stories, as was logos actually. So like, I guess the logos would be like kind of like a more sort of analytical, planning nuts and bolts description, whereas like mythos would be like would be used in like Homer, for example. If someone was speaking in mythos, it carried the sense of advice or counsel, or even command. There's an imperative sense to it. So if you go back to the sort of Dark Age Greeks, right? Like they clearly had this idea of mythos as being something that you should listen to, right? This was actually bound up with this idea of this body of stories that were kind of like passed down from generation to generation, that might not be true in the literal sense, but you should still listen to them, right?
Like
and
a parable.
Potentially, yeah, that's that's
Aesop.
certainly an example. Yes, kind of. I guess the big difference is that we know Aesop wrote the fables, right? Like we can point to a specific person and say, this one guy wrote that.
Oh, bless your heart.
Unless he heard it and then wrote it down.
Well,
right?
okay. I mean, yeah, unless Aesop himself was a myth. I don't know. I mean, if we redirect to more modern writers,
the causticness of historians, like, well, I believe in the evangelist, but Aesop, no.
But that point does apply certainly to like modern writers. You can point to a specific person who wrote
Did
like
Nietzsche actually
a certain
exist?
Book, Yeah, right, or Shakespeare.
Oh, but there you go.
That's apparently
we'll get Hans back on with his.
I do not want to believe that about Shakespeare, but go on.
But the thing is, Shakespeare works as mythos too, and you do point, John, to this as a character of myth when you're talking about the memes, which we want to get to. Is myth doesn't feel like it has a single author for the culture.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Right. Yes. And actually, so I was listening to one of your episodes recently on Marshall McLuhan's Brides, and because you're going over very similar territory to what we're talking about right now, but from the point of view of advertising, I was like, oh man, yeah, I missed a huge trick there actually in that whole section, because yes, obviously the characters run into. Right, the characters we run into in ads are archetypes, actually, or they have become archetypes as well. So yeah, and probably more so than say superheroes, because I guess with advertising archetypes, in principle, you can track down who wrote the copy for a given ad, right? Which agency it came from, but they're all sort of drawing on such similar sort of tropes that saying exactly where that idea came from, because it gets pretty fuzzy. And the copywriter is very much in the background.
Yes, and Dorothy Sayers has this thing saying they don't even know the copyright. The copywriter should not be people you can identify as existing. In effect, right?
Yes.
Because
they should be
the ad is effective because it taps into something it's kind of already there, but not. It's like crystallizing. It's yeah.
Right.
So, Casey, myth as I read it is what we do, right, in our Mosaic Ark work, right? We're trying to pay attention. It's poetry, right? It's tapping into, and the ancient myths are in poems, right? They're Homer and Ovid and Aeneid and things like that. It's like, and they have that character of reality that's more, it's Platonic, right? Mythos is very Platonic. And Plato uses myth in his philosophy, right? Which is interesting because everybody thinks of, people can think of Plato as like analytical, but he's actually mystical. And there's both of those are part of the Western tradition. As opposed to logos, which is also Platonic, but it's also in people's understanding more the dialectic Aristotelian mode.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think myth is it uses fiction to highlight truth.
Yes.
Right? So
yes.
And logic uses just pure facts and reason. There's no fiction surrounding it necessarily. But there can be a really important nuance there, because you can also use truth and logic to tell a lie. Right? Yeah.
So if you look at how
all of the myths of science, right? You've gone through some of those in detail now, right? It's like the science. I think you're saying the science itself depends on myth, right? There's science is all grounded on myth in this way, right? Not the fantasy, but the sort of conviction of reality to the premise that you're starting from. It's turtles all the way down. Or it's just one big turtle.
Yeah, actually, a lot of scientists in my experience,
it's just a turtle floating.
If you if you question the mythology, that their personal mythology that they buy into, which most scientists tend to buy in, they tend to follow the mythology of science, which is very much your sort of atheist Richard Dawkins Big Bang sort of crude materialist, bottom up, emergent kind of way of understanding reality. Reality is a clockwork mechanism, essentially. And if you sort of challenge that, I've had them get very angry.
Of course.
On
Of
occasion.
course.
Mm.
Yeah.
It's
But one of the interesting things that I've noticed over the years,
sacred.
though.
You've touched their sacred. I can
Yes.
tell you, I know we had this conversation.
Or expose them.
Well, no, it's my example for me. I'm a historian. Touch chronology, and I'm the lizard thing goes right. I'm like,
I've seen it.
Are you saying flamenco? Are you saying flamenco was right?
I actually used the Tartaria stuff in a class I taught precisely for this reason, to show it's like the ground of history is being able to put things in that chronological order. And if someone comes along and starts messing with it, oh my gosh, I am freaked out instantaneously in ways I had not quite anticipated when this
Right.
happened in our writing group, right? And I'm like, wow, I'm really upset.
Yeah.
Okie dokie, I
Yeah.
found mine, right? It's like
Why am I so upset about this? Right.
the
Yeah.
why,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
you know when someone's touched your myth, when you're you know those lizards that have the fringes and they go right. That was me.
But what makes me even more sort of convinced that is a very widespread myth, especially in the academic sciences, is precisely who gets angry if you question that, right? So my personal experience has been that if I have that conversation with physicists, mathematicians, people who are at the higher end of the hard sciences, they don't get angry so much. A lot of them are like, "Oh yeah, no, yeah, mind underlying everything. Yeah, that kind of makes sense. Actually, I can see."
Well,
that.
it's you haven't touched their myth, right? That's the interesting. It's like I can be perfectly calm about all sorts of things, but then there's this thing that whoa, you touched that.
Totally.
Really upset.
Yeah, I mean, if you question like relativity or quantum mechanics, they might get a little angry at you.
Right.
But right. But if you question that to a biologist, for example, or a sociologist, they will get, I found, much more angrier than the physicists will, because they're very sort of, they are attached to this as a fundamental underlying underpinning of their entire world.
Wait, define this again. For the sociologists are upset by
this being like the sort of the myth of the world is a machine, basically.
Right. Okay.
That metaphor, like that is basically underpins the Darwinian idea. If the world isn't a machine, you don't necessarily even need Darwinism, actually, because now there's room for teleology, there's room for design to come in from somewhere. So there's alternative explanations for biological structure formation and evolution that don't necessarily have to involve like a bottom-up natural selection process. I don't rule it out either, but it becomes less necessary.
That would bother a sociologist in particular. Why, do you think? For your example.
Because the
entire society is built on it, right? On this presumption of natural selection.
So the sociologists are all communists, and of course the communists are all materialists. So that's basically
okay.
Yes.
Well, I actually
that works.
I do have an answer. But there's a book called the Sacred Project of American Sociology by Christian Smith. And his sociology is a religion. It has a religious premise that we can that the individual needs to be liberated. It is, you're right, it's a very, communism is actually, the ideal is everybody gets to be free, right? You can be liberated by the work of all the machines that everybody's being served by. But that the progressive model of the individual is the individual would be free if not for the strictures of society that therefore need to be fixed. Right. And it's
eliminated.
It's the fixableness of the society that sociology depends on. It's like you're going to do a study and figure out how to fix all these bad things so that the people can flourish. It's ironic.
I would also.
It's such an odd thing to say to the people. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say I would also argue that a materialist conception of reality, and in particular mankind, is necessary in order to even conceptualize of human beings as objects that can be rationally programmed by sort of scientific sociological interventions, and that would even be like a moral thing to do in the first place for a kind of managerial experts to kind of come in and be like, okay, well, we've done the studies, we know the stuff.
Of course, it's moral.
We've decided
because they're there.
Yeah.
this is the best way for you. Like, we don't really care what you think. We're just going to like operate on you because it's in your best interests. And you look at like, in psychology, like, B. Skinner behaviorism, underlines this entire way of looking at human psychology. It's just like, a machine. And because it's a machine, there's no moral value to it. So you can kind of do to it whatever you want to do to it.
But
right?
there is
as long as the outcomes.
But there is a premise of benefit. Maybe okay. So I is asking, will you guys talk about what materialism means to you?
I would say that's just the philosophical position that all there is matter.
Mm-hmm.
And that consciousness is an epiphenomenon that emerges from, sufficiently complex organizations of matter.
So there's an obverse of that saying that everything material is actually an illusion, and I mean, so there's the strong.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's I'm reading Arthur Herman's book, The Cave and the Light, is actually really good on the Plato and Aristotle like binary that we're caught in, and a lot of it is this, right? That in Aristotelian terms, you observe the world, build up with descriptions and categories and processes, yes. And it will be then understandable because you've described everything. But that's not, I mean, Aristotle's not necessarily completely materialist because he does actually have a sense of like purpose, which it's hard to have in a truly material,
and just like
world
Plato
has no purpose in that.
And Plato isn't completely idealist either.
Plato isn't completely idealist, but platonically, it's like if the ideas mainly exist and its matter is a corruption or a pollution to the ideas, and Christianity tries to live in between these two, which is, we are spiritual beings incarnate and we're supposed to be both.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. It was just, in my opinion, the correct approach, actually, rather than trying to decide between them. I would say Aristotle is more, it's more the theoretician versus the empiricist.
Right.
Aristotle is paying very close attention to reality as far as he can perceive it and trying to kind of reason from that, whereas Plato is starting from first principles and trying to reason logically and mathematically almost from these first principles to then arrive at reality. And these are both ways that our brains work. In fact, I mentioned Ian McGilchrist earlier. I write about him a lot. So he's got this, he's done a lot of work on the differences in hemispheric cognition between the left and the right hemispheres of the brain, right? And so there's the myth, if you will, that the left brain is logical and the right brain is creative. He's like, this is actually bullshit. And neuroscientists will tell you this,
isn't it? Right?
Well,
I'm laughing at myself now.
And then like people who know that is bullshit will then kind of go from there to be like, oh well, obviously like any talk about there being hemispheric differences in cognition is just bullshit. That's been debunked, And it's like he's like, well, actually, no, that's not true. It's just like, that was a really bad idea that people were running with way back in the day. And like, yes, that is not true, but there are profound differences. And what those differences are, the left hemisphere is about manipulating the world and acquiring things from it. The right hemisphere is more about sensing the world and just kind of like seeing the world as it is, being present in reality. And McGilchrist, is of the opinion that this is an adaptation developed by animal life very early on, for the very simple reason that every single animal has to solve two incompatible problems. They have to get what they need in the world, without getting got by other things in the world, right? So one of them, the first one requires like focused attention, and the second one requires very broad attention. And you can't do both of them simultaneously. If you're only doing one, like if you're so focused on getting that cheese that you don't see the cat, well, the cat's going to eat you, right? But if you're so focused on not getting eaten by a cat that you never actually get around to eating the cheese, you're going to starve to death, right? So you need to. So basically, the way
so you need awareness and goal.
solved this problem.
You need the situational
right.
awareness.
So
and
it just
the thing
divided the brain into two
different functions.
Right? Different functions, right? And the problem, as he sees it, is that the left hemisphere has a tendency towards being blind to various aspects of reality, to getting obsessed with its own models, to unreasonable unreasonable belief in its own efficacy. And the right hemisphere sort of isn't maybe quite so active, but actually, according to when they've done like IQ tests, for example, or cognitive tests, when the hemispheres are separated, it always turns out the right hemisphere actually is much more intelligent than the left hemisphere. And
the poets win.
So it's actually
no wait.
Yeah, well, right, but actually, and then so. Earlier on, we were talking about this idea of like, we once lived in a living cosmos, and then we kind of killed God. Well, what actually happened here was really just we turned off our right hemispheres.
Well, so then it's like enlightenment versus romanticism. It's reason versus art, right? It's
and
like,
and now I'm even more annoyed at the term enlightenment now, because it was just the biggest gaslight in history.
Yes, it's very much so.
You're enlightened. Shut up all the lights. Okay.
Well, McGilchrist actually he shows in some of his work that this has been like a cyclic thing that's happened in human history, going back sort of at least to the Greeks. So he's something of an art historian as well, and he's noted that artists who have sustained severe hemispheric damage to the right hemisphere, their art will sort of take on a very particular set of qualities. Will often lose depth. It becomes very flat. Things will get out of proportion with each other. So think of modern art, for example. But also,
that must be so frustrating for the artist. I can't even imagine.
I mean, if you don't know, you don't know, right? I mean, and he points out that this has actually kind of gone back and forth throughout the history of Western art, at least, where you'll have periods where art is very representational, very detailed, very lifelike, where obviously the artists are paying very close attention to the human form, to the natural world. And then you have periods where art suddenly reverts and it becomes very flat and sort of geometrical, and his hypothesis is that this is actually corresponding. This is an indicator of a society which is where the modal person is sort of like utilizing both of their hemispheres on a regular, like listening to both of their hemispheres, as it were, on a regular basis, versus one where the left hemisphere is just kind of like taken over completely, which can happen because of too much bureaucratization in society. That's one of the main things he points out is bureaucratization, I think. But yeah.
Well, the chicken and egg of it truly is this chicken and egg problem of and this is where I moderate sympathy with the sociologist and trying to figure out, it's like, well, we are actually affected by our society, right? That bureaucracy, which we're living in right now, that's overwhelming and uncorrectable, which bureaucracies seem to be by definition, is stifling and such. And so, but ironically, sociology is going to fix the bureaucracy by being more, right? It's like
by being more bureaucratic, right? Yeah, exactly. Right. Yes.
That, I mean, another thing that we've talked about a lot is like the cities. A city, I just like my baseline, keep saying this out loud all the time, is cities are the great artifact of humanity, right? They're good, but they obviously can, become, deadly and constricting and such. And so architecture is the magnificent example there of, you've built something, now it's like physically imposing in the environment, you've imagined it into reality, right? People put it together and build it and things, and then all of this architecture. My deep meditation is like streets that have curbs. Somebody had to go put put all the curbs. And then the curb is just like, you can fall off it. You can twist your ankle. They're boundaries for your dog can go on or off. And
the curb. Like, I think the curbs.
No, just curbs.
Okay.
Like,
Yeah.
If I live in Chicago, right? It's like surrounded by this built environment, which is both completely a human invention and completely constricting, because it's here now. And so it's like we do this with ourselves. I mean, the horrible thing here is like, how do you deal with all of this? Well, if every so often war comes along and you blow up all the buildings, you get to start over. Oh no, wait. Right?
Yeah,
it's a real problem.
Well, that's actually that's one of the things that Miguel Christ points out, is that like in his historical treatment, he sort of notes that like you have this kind of golden age where people are in both of their hemispheres are working. So think of like classical Greece, think of Renaissance Italy, think of 19th century Europe.
Building lots of new buildings.
Lots of new buildings, but like, the art is, like I said, it's very like representational arts. And it usually these areas are also known as like high points of philosophy and culture and the science and all this. But then as a result of all of that, you have a very prosperous society. The prosperity then leads to a kind of bureaucratic overgrowth. And then things kind of solidify. And then that solidification of the social order then leads to people becoming sort of greedy and acquisitive and rule following, and as a result of this, like spending more and more time in their left hemisphere mode of cognition, which then leads to a lot of kind of blindness, because the left hemisphere just doesn't see what it doesn't know, essentially, whereas the right hemisphere can see something without worrying about understanding what it is, right? And then as a result, those societies usually collapse because they will end up behaving in increasingly antisocial ways with each other and making increasingly terrible mistakes. And then, maybe you do get a big war, or, you get an actual collapse, barbarian invasions, what have you, and things kind of reset back to state of nature. And the cycle is able to begin again. And, I find it very interesting. It's very similar to Spengler's treatment of historical cycles, where you start out in this sort of mythic springtime age of the culture when everyone is living in villages or in rural areas. And, the myths are sort of experienced as being very true, it's kind of naive but vital at the same time. And then you have this maturation process that the society will go through, and then eventually you end up in the civilization stage of the world city, where it sort of ossifies and almost like fossilizes into the this all these like concrete urban structures. And at that point, the society starts to lose touch with its actual root in the land and the spiritual vision that it came from. It exhausts itself and dies. And, of course, Spengler pointed out numerous examples where this had happened.
I'm thinking of more as you're talking.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, this could obviously happen on a planetary scale as well. If you had a planetary culture, as we do.
Have a planetary. We very much have a planetary culture now. It's like the McLuhan meditation. It's all bound. It's been bound together since the telegraph, electrically.
But what I find interesting with McGilchrist's view on this is it's actually kind of like quietly optimistic, because it sort of says like, well, actually, if it's really all just kind of a switch in our brains, then all we have to do is figure out how to keep switching ourselves back into that right hemisphere dominant mode of consciousness. And if we can do that on a large enough scale, maybe we can kind of pull back from societal collapse and re-enchant the world that we live in. Because a lot of it is just kind of how it's a matter of perception, right?
That's what Casey wanted to ask you about.
That was my overarching question as I was reading the Reenchantment of the World article. What do you do? How do you do it? Right? The overarching, well, how do you do it? Do you do it just by what we're doing right here? You just encourage people to be creative and write and get around the obstacles other people have put. I think obstacles actually make your work stronger.
Yeah,
I don't think people end up doing it. Go ahead.
I don't think it's that simple. Like, I don't know if there is an easy answer in terms of like how to. It's like,
well, so this, I was going to challenge you on this, because at the end of the reenchantment article, when you showed the let's talk about the memes, right? Talk through these memes.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Because that was a really good example. I mean, we've talked about them as the archetypes and things like that, but it's just like break that down a bit. But then you hold that thought. But then you get to a suggestion, which I thought maybe you've changed your mind since May, but because the degree to which we can purposefully do this is challenging. Yeah. Like we purposefully make a new myth. And I have my doubts, but talk about the memes. Talk about the memes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I even before we got to the meme part, I sort of was talking like, can you design a religion?
Right.
I sort of come to the answer. It's like, not if you're honest. And if you try to do it, it'll blow up in your face ultimately.
Right. It looks fake and everybody can tell.
Yeah.
But yes,
exactly.
Yes, it's like that. There's the fakeness. It just fills the So the fakeness doesn't work. The memes are participating in something. We need to think about that.
Right.
Tapping into broad consciousness, right?
Well, and also in the internet, I liked it. I liked you called that the fiber optic step.
Fiber optic, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great name.
I mean, that's partly like, playing into the youth rights obsession with like Proto-Indo-Europeanism and such. And that's like a meme in itself, actually.
It's Tartaria. It's the Mongols. Come on, that's where they live on the steppe.
Yeah, raiding and writing.
Yes. Yeah, this is the whole conspiracy theory. Was Genghis Khan actually a Mongol, or did he have red hair?
Really?
I missed that one. Okay.
Yeah.
No, I picked red hair because who else would have red hair? Right?
Well, it's less crazy. It's less crazy than you think when you just consider like the rate of gene flow across the steppe. And the fact that the Mongols of 800 years ago might not have looked a lot like the Mongols now, because after all, they did absorb a whole lot of East Asian DNA after conquering China.
True.
So yeah.
So the memes traveling across the steppe like that too. It's like, where did they come from? We don't know. Whose are they? How do they have so many children? If the Genghis Khan metaphor is there, right? It's like
they're creative. That's why creations beget other creations.
But yeah, I mean, the thing that I find fascinating with internet memes as a cultural phenomenon is that they're not owned by anyone.
Right.
They kind of just seem to emerge from collective image manipulation and storytelling without any specific authorship. Like, we know it's a human creation, right? Like, no one thinks like, oh, God made these. Right? These are obviously made by teenagers joking on the internet. It can, if you ask it, but they're really bad.
But this will be a test. It's like, can the AI generated thing, like the girl with the puppy in the hurricane, right? Can those become me? It's like the sort of that they're collectively made, but AI is kind of like this it's allegedly a collective consciousness that everyone's drawing on, and that it can't create, it can only add to things that have already been expressed by us.
Yeah, I mean, large language models are basically talking libraries, right? Like a lossy Google is another way it's been put. It's got the whole internet in there. It's a kind of like condensation of the collective mind of humanity, or at least what we've written. And you can ask it questions. You don't have to like look things up like you would in an ordinary library. You can ask it like
well, it's a big search engine.
Question you want.
It's a collective. It's an aggregating search engine.
Mhm.
but which has the ability to recombine things according to the question that you asked,
Right.
right? So it's not just an index system.
That's true. It's not just an index.
It's like a book that talks back to you,
No, the
essentially.
thing is, I
Um,
resist that because the it's like composition. So I guess there's a difference between like authorship is composition. It's putting it literally put things together, compose, and put things together.
yes.
And the AI is in fact composing in that sense. But that's where we were with our creativity. It's like will the AI, not just AI, but when we write poetry, you do science or something, like you're trying to put together patterns that you've seen elsewhere and they come together and they feel meaningful because you've composed them.
So one thing that I find interesting, actually, I just kind of thought about this with AI. So there's all these all these theories about creativity out there, right? People are always trying to like, how does creativity work, right? And so many books have been written about this. And I don't think anyone's ever really had like a definitive answer on it. But like one of the ones that like always seems very perennial is like, oh well, there isn't really creativity. All that's really happening is
Right. We have
that
no
you're just
creativity ourselves. Right.
recombining
Yeah.
you're just recombining stuff that you've come across before and it looks new, but like and it's like, okay, that is an element of it, right? Like anyone who's ever like written a story and it's like, self-consciously like grabbed like a trope from another
Mhm.
writer, totally. But that's literally all AI
Hmm.
does. It's all it can do, right? And the low quality of what comes out of it actually, like, sort of suggests that there's more to it than that, actually. And then, if you talk to almost any creative, they will talk about inspiration, about like, just
Mhm.
you kind of have this like you just get grabbed by something and it just pours through you and you have no idea where it came from, like the genius loci,
Hmm.
right? And I don't think the AI can do that. I think that's something that so far only because we still don't know exactly how that works. Um,
Yeah. I mean, human inspiration when they're creating something is unique because every human being is unique. AI seems nothing more than the remnants of other people's creations. So
yes,
it's not going to have a lot of depth to it because of that. In other words, it doesn't have a soul.
and the way that large language models work is specifically by predicting the most likely completion of a character string given the previous character string, right?
Hmm.
Um, so by the very nature of that, it's going to be making derivative crap
Yeah.
because one of the essences of genuine creativity is you need to be a little bit surprising. Like you don't want to be
Hmm.
too unfamiliar or your readers get totally lost, but you also don't want them to be able to predict every single thing that you're going to say because then obviously it's boring,
Yeah.
right? So you
Right.
there needs to be novelty in there.
Hmm.
AI is unable to surprise. That's like when you read a text written by an AI, your eyes glaze over. This is
Yeah, there. Well,
Yeah.
it's why I mean. So I was actually thinking about John Carter movie. I actually enjoyed it, and which was interesting because it's obviously a lot of CGI for particularly the green guys, the Martians. Um, but most of the time, I hate movies. I so despise CGI movies now because
CGI.
it's just
Yes.
like I mean, it's like it's the same problem of the AI text, right? It's glaze over. I don't care about this. It's not real.
It's because they put any story in it.
Well, no, but
That's
it's
why
just
Yeah.
it's taking the
it's
place.
it's the I don't even like looking at it, right? It's the
Mm.
the massed armies of orcs or something. Sorry, Wiga. But John, you also talked about the way the AI, another phenomenon. So we got the memes that are coming out of the collective consciousness of the human beings that are interacting in this internet step.
Hmm.
But we also have the AI and in other ways, like the technology creating illusions and lies, which is
Yes.
hugely
Right.
important. It's like, in fact, the worst case scenario, which is already reality, unfortunately, is AI.
Yeah.
You can't trust anything. It's like you're not going to be able to trust a
No.
thing that we see on the internet because it's
No.
all
And like,
illusions and
and this is already
hallucinations.
on Facebook, and like baby boomers, they get taken in by this stuff all the time because they have no defense against this naturally, right? So they're always like they'll see like some AI generated image of like an African child who just made an amazing um, mock up of an
Mm.
airplane out of plastic bottles or something, right? And they're like, wow, it's like that was it. Like that never happened to you. but like they think it's real, or like, very recently there was an AI generated image of this miserable looking little girl clutching her teddy bear or
It's a
puppy dog
puppy.
or something. Puppy dog.
I
Yeah.
saw the one where
Right.
she was
Yeah.
riding the alligator. Come on.
I missed that one. I want to see that one now.
Yeah, someone had a good one on Twitter the other day where it was like for Hurricane Milton, it was like this little girl like holding her like little baby Tyrannosaurus Rex, and he just like captioned it like the pictures coming out of Florida are just heartbreaking.
Yes, it's like that. Right. So it ends up in this situation where, as I think you rightly point out, we end up back in the oral storytelling. It's like you're only going to be able to believe what you actually hear physically from another person, which I think is delightful. It's
no,
like we're back.
Not even that. You'll only be able to believe for sure what you saw with your own eyes in real life. If you saw it on the screen, it could have been AI.
Right.
If you hear it from a person, how trustworthy was that person? Did it have the ring of truth? Which very much takes us back right to the days of oral culture, like you said, where like, you've got like rumors swirling around and folk tales and stories and, what's true and what isn't. And it's like, well, you kind of have to take everything you hear with a few grains of salt. And, like, obviously, this has never really stopped being true.
It's always been true. Yes. There's illusions of things like, if it's printed, it's real. It's like, are you kidding me?
Right.
Wow.
Exactly.
Wow.
Right.
I read in a book.
But
that's nice.
But I think, right. Exactly. And like we went through this period in the 20th century, the era of mass media, where because of the power of moving visual images to trick the subconscious mind into thinking that it was looking at something real, especially because it's like, I didn't paint this image, right? I just took a picture with my photograph, right?
So it's real.
So you think that's it's real, right? And then of course there's all the little editing tricks that they can use to, sort of give a very misleading version of what you're seeing. That might be, this is like I said before, it's possible to lie with the truth, right? The picture itself is quite true, but, like there's something just off screen that if you saw it would totally change
the framing
the narrative
everything.
that you're being sold.
No,
right, exactly.
Photographs are always framed.
Right. And my sort of hope is that because of AI's ability to generate an infinite amount of absolute nonsense, it'll break that spell for the population. We're like, we'll kind of go into we'll find ourselves in a world where like, if you see it on a screen, like it's like, was it real? I don't know. Like maybe.
Yeah.
And everything just comes as maybe. And now you're in a very different, the propagandist's job becomes much more difficult in this case. But that's
an interesting place to go. So you're a propagandist in this current reality, which is where we are. What do you do? Right? Because I mean, happily everybody has been more like aware of the artifice in media, which has always been the case, right? It was like one of the things we do in our writing with our Draco Chemicus, we like the advertising, right? We've been living in this faux truth, like an apple a day keeps the doctor away, which was the cider apple slogan after Prohibition drove out the alcohol industry, right? Oh, well, we got to sell these some other way, so we'll say they're health food.
It was
Johnny Appleseed was
all of the number of advertising slogans that we've like talk about our mythology, right? Yeah. Our current mythology, it's the World War II cataclysm of sacredness, but it's also the advertising slogans. People will think an advertising slogan is absolutely true. It's up there with the sonnet on the Statue of Liberty that I quote a lot, right? Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Oh, okay, immigration policy. It was a poem.
Right, the zeroth amendment of the United States, as Steve Saylor has called it, and he's accurate.
It's a
poem.
Actually,
it's a poem, but it occupies. Because it has this incredible emotional power over the American mind, it ends up.
It's a poem written on a stone tablet. right? Like the Ten Commandments.
Yeah, yeah, but the same is actually true, I would say, of the First and Second Amendments of the U.S. Constitution. Right, this is not a primarily legal document.
This is why
If you look
in
at
the Dragon Common Room we learn to scan so that we're not taken in by other people's iambic pentameter. Which is
But
part
it's like
of the artifice,
that,
right?
like,
Everyone, the frame of the photograph, the rhythm of the language, right? Shakespeare scans.
Yeah.
It's why it sticks in people's heads. It's not just it makes it memorable.
Yeah,
It
like an
it makes
incantation.
it's right. It's an incant. It's sticky as a sound form. It stays with you. It's like a musical. It's a musical phrase.
If you look at American politics through the lens of civic religion, a lot becomes a lot more clear,
Right.
I think.
Yeah.
So, you've got the Republican Party who, why are they the Republican Party? Because they're the guardians of the old republic. And what's the old republic? Well, that's the idea that you should cleave to the original writings in the Constitution. In particular, the First and Second Amendment. Those are the ones that sort of grab people, like your average American, or at least half of them, kind of at a spiritual level, right? It's like where they have this fierce attachment to the idea that they should be able to speak their mind, worship whatever god they want, and own guns to defend themselves against government, right? This is at a mythic
Are you
level,
saying this is
foundational
not,
to American character.
Wait.
But then that is in conflict.
I'm gonna get.
That is in conflict with the alternative
wear my
civic
hat that I every
which, the 0th Amendment of which is that poem at the basis of the Statue of Liberty, the Holy Scripture of which is the Civil Rights Act of the 1964, right? And legally they're not really that compatible. There's a lot of conflict there, but philosophically they're completely incompatible as well. And one is trying to avoid getting displaced by the other, and the other is trying to displace the one. And of course, who are the champions of the civil rights civic religion? Well, the Democrat Party. Why are they called the Democrat Party? Because, well, they want to turn their old republic into a democracy, which is a fundamentally different form of government.
These are battling archetypes. It's like the most real place they exist in is things like political cartoons and the iconography. Right. Absolutely.
Yes.
The donkey versus the elephant. Completely true. At that Platonic mythological level, which is in fact, as we've been talking about, where people's convictions actually live, right? It's like there's no such there's no such, you can't, and this so this is our next layer of problem, which is like we can't not have myths, right? Because without myths, people lie down and die, right? So it's interesting with the World War II. It's crumbling. It's not great. I've said this before, that my first intimation for my own person that this was going to happen was a fight that I had in the 90s with my dad over the atomic bomb. Right. And just to hit there was the Enola Gay exhibit of the plane and in the Smithsonian, and there was some scholarship that came out around questioning whether or not it was necessary to drop the bomb. And I brought that up with my dad, whose father was stationed in Burma during the war. And Dad was just like, I can't talk about this. And I'm like, but it's an interesting historical question. He's like, I can't talk about it. It's horrible. You can't even question that. People would have died if we hadn't dropped those bombs, right? And that was the first intimation that I had. I didn't put it in those terms then, but I'm here in the presence of something that exists at another layer of, it's no longer a policy decision about what was the right way to deal with this military situation. It's myth, right? You can't
why this is why I came to the sort of conclusion that the only way out is to tell a better story, something which is more true and more compelling than the alternatives, right? Ideally it would have to describe reality better than the modern story, not just the World War II myth. I mean, the scientism story, right?
That's a big one. Breaking the scientism one.
It's a big story. Yeah. Well, scientism sort of underlies almost like the World War II myth. It's more fundamental.
Yes.
And And it is extremely true with the level of detail, right? Like this is it's incredibly granular with its description of reality, uh, which is kind of serves like almost like a propagandistic effect for it. It's like, well, you have so many details accurate, then how could we be, wrong about the big picture, right?
Well, this was
Frankly,
the problem for
a lot of academia is kind of very similar, right?
Yeah.
It's like, look at all of my footnotes. How could I be wrong, right?
What?
Like,
You don't believe in the footnote? Oh no, I might need to lie down. No, this is the thing is this is the problem for the 19th century with history, right? History had that character because God became incarnate in time. I mean, this is the irony of what happened in the 19th century with the Jesus stories, is they were undone by their own method, which is we
yes.
live in AD. We live in a meaningful timeline. The timeline really, really matters. We better get it right. And then David Friedrich Strauss comes along and says, well, actually, you can't make a good timeline out of the Gospels. Oh my gosh, right? The whole thing just shatters.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
Casey wrote this line, and it's the most true line in our entire poem now. Can you just say it out loud? The very gifts he gave her stole her heart away, right? It's like, that is, you've pinned our entire poem, and it's so true, right?
That's good.
Yeah, isn't it good? Because we're trying to describe
really
the turning
good.
from God, and he's given all these gifts to our
Yes.
our main character.
Yes.
And the gifts he gave her turned her heart away.
No, that describes it perfectly, because like to a large degree, the sort of like the rationalism that came with the Enlightenment was an outgrowth of the conception of the world as a logical,
as meaningful,
rules-based cosmos, because that's the kind of cosmos that a loving God would develop. And but then you follow those implications too far, and eventually they turn around and say, well, actually, like if you apply the same reasoning to God, like there's no proof for God, so therefore God doesn't exist, right? A lot of it, I think, and this is what I kind of got to at the end of the essay, we talk about the God of the infinite question, is just becoming deeply comfortable with ambiguity, with like paradoxes that can't be resolved, with open questions that will never have an answer, with the fact that we will never have the final answers to a lot of things, that we'll always have more questions than we do answers, that the size of the unknown will always dwarf the little island of the known that we sit on. And if you take that view of things and sort of abandon that need for absolute certainty before you can say, oh, I will consider this or not, as a possibility, right? Then you're living more in a world of maybes, like what Robert Anton Wilson would have called maybe logic, where rather than trying to like nail things down and say, okay, this is definitely true, that is definitely false, you're like, well, there's this sort of fuzzy continuum of like maybe not, and almost everything is sort of in that, including sort of questions about like, is this myth literally true, or is it a parable, or is it like a misremembering of something that happened in history, or is it just a made up bullshit story, or is it the archetypes, or is it psychologically true, or maybe it's all those things, maybe it's none of them. It's sort of you sort of stay in that place of uncertainty. This also makes, at the political level, makes the propagandist job much more difficult, because the propagandist generally wants to. They're both true at the same
time. It's this both and.
Yeah.
It's the both and.
Right. So like they say something and they want you to believe it, but like if you're kind of in this maybe state all the time, and you're like, well, maybe what he said. It's very difficult to get you out of that state, So it makes makes people much more difficult to manipulate.
So the people that first well, not absolutely first, but some of the people that were first talking to me about McLuhan have this project talking about the way in which we're now in the digital, it's like that McLuhan talked through there's the oral, it's not just oral to written, but manuscript to print to electric.
Yes.
What we're in now is the digital, because all of our media, it's like we're in sand. I talk about your image of the river running through the ice. We're talking on light through sand. and glass, right?
Like LaRoe's
Mhm.
window, only like, millions of fractals of it everywhere.
Always.
They seem to be, yeah, it's information almost at the speed of thought at this point, which is kind of
Right.
scary.
And that also, one of the interesting things in a world of light is that time kind of disappears, which has actually happened in the 21st century. If you look at like the culture is kind of simultaneously frozen and accelerated
Yes.
in this very strange fashion,
Yeah.
like there there are no more rock stars anymore. There's no more real celebrities. We still have like kind of legacy celebrities left over from the previous media age, but like there aren't really any new ones.
True. There aren't. Yeah.
And yeah, because like everything, rather than having to wait for something to come to be played on the radio or to come on TV, it's all immediately, instantly available, right? There's no time delay in your ability to talk to someone, your ability to call up an archive of information if you want to like read a book, watch a movie, listen to some music. Like it's all just simultaneously, immediately there, as though time has basically ceased to exist. And
Yeah.
then the kind of result of that is we're all sort of like living in this like eternal present, the current year, right? And it, you have simultaneously this like constant sense of like imminent doom that everyone kind of like lives with, like the world's just about to end, like immediately, like the next moment. But at the same time, nothing ever happens, right? Like that meme, like nothing ever happens. It's like so like that really that taps into something pretty fundamental these days, because it also feels like no matter what catastrophes happen, it's like things still sort of are just stuck and frozen and like don't really change. Even though you can look over like just the last few years and be like, wow, the world has changed in dramatic ways, mostly for the worse, which is part of the doom feeling.
Right.
But at the same time, it's sort of like it's changed, but it hasn't. Things like you point to AI as another interesting example of this, right? So like we anticipated the onset of AI for generations, right? Like so much science fiction was written about AI, so much anxiety about it. Okay, well, a couple of years ago, large language models hit the internet in the big way, and like Stable Diffusion and DALL-E and all these like image generation AIs and movie generation AIs. Okay, this totally exists. Okay, how did the world change? Actually,
right? Yeah.
And like within a very short period of time, it went from like AI will change the world, and the singularity will happen, to like then we got AI, and we're all kind of like
shrug.
That's a shrug. Yeah, okay, that's a nice story. We all right. Yeah, exactly.
So where does a new myth come from, right? And so the thing is, I don't think we can consciously make it, right? I don't think I don't think that works. But I also think, I mean, it's like the dissolution of the World War II power of that emotional sacred grip on people, so that it can turn into a historical event that we then think about as Christ did, right? It's like it's that big in people's mind. The problem is that, and this is where we've been talking about the Girardian twinning and such. What we haven't dealt with is like the sacrifice moment. I mean, it's hard. It's hard. World War II is enormous because it was like cataclysmically violent, right? Horrible, and that level of psychological spiritual effect it's like we can look back on things and say, well, that clearly defined the era, the crusade, right? The first crusade or something like that. It defines it for a generation or three. These sort of events do have these expiration cycles. It's like it's cataclysmic at the time, and then it dies away and something else happens. One, it tends not to be what people intend or like or want. And two, I mean, sacrificial or violent or horribly destructive and terrifying. Are we sitting here waiting for that one, the doom feeling, right? We're sitting here waiting for the doom to fall, or
and have we been put in this psychological state by an overarching controller somewhere, people, so that so that we'll do what we're told.
So I think it's certainly not possible for one person or a small group to just like sit down and like, write like the new myth,
Plan this
like
out.
that's, you can't plan it out like that. Now at the same time, well, you can't do that if you want to,
I think the
are you one of the
WAF has
good
tried.
guys? Are you one of the good guys or are you one of the bad guys, right? If you're one of the bad guys, then like you could totally do that, right? Like, so this is like literally what the marketers do, right? Like in like McLuhan's Bride, like this is like their whole thing is like, getting into the background where they disappear, the wizard behind the curtain, and putting these kind of fake myths out there to psychologically manipulate people, right? This is what all of public relations is, all marketing, all advertising, right?
It's interesting with the celebrities, right? Because Bernays invents the celebrities as the political props, right? Takes the celebrities to Coolidge and makes them cool, which he doesn't.
Right.
Yeah, and that we're losing
and then, like,
that.
Celebrities themselves actually, that's a function of moving images to a large degree. Also, isn't it weird that we worship actors? Like historically, like actors were considered
interesting.
Like,
we're back to Taylor Kitsch in the slides, right? So we're like an interesting effect of he did not become one of these celebrities thanks to John Carter. Curiously,
that is interesting. Yeah.
Doesn't always work for them.
John Carter somehow broke the celebrity mold. What do we do with that?
He probably just refused to do something terrible at a private party.
Well, that's reassuring.
Like,
that's
it is actually. But so if you want to be one of the good guys, you can't fake the myth, right? What you can do is maintain this sort of state of open awareness. Like as an artist would do when you're sort of like you're looking for inspiration, you're trying to like stay open to like the influences in the world in order to like to bring those in and let it channel itself through you, right? People can try to do that individually and doing that in a group as well. And be conscious about where those influences are coming from. I think one of the reasons that the World War II myth didn't get created in World War II, that actually got built up about 20 or 30 years later, when it really got sort of the elements of it really started like slotting together in a strongly like mythological sense. And this was all, again, marketing and public relations that did this.
Well, so they did it on purpose, but they also did it using the materials available, I think, right? There's the psychological materials available.
You lie.
They activate.
You lie by telling the truth, right? Like that's always their shtick. So the converse of that is you tell the truth by lying, I guess, which is, it's where the storytellers come in, the actual mythologists. It's obviously too large of a task for one person to do. It's got to be like participatory in over a large number of people. You can't have any one author. The other reason for that, which I kind of went into earlier in that essay, is just that like if you have it's a very practical matter that like if you have something which is written by one person and there's like copyright attached to that, and those rights can be purchased and then used by someone else for their own purposes. But if something is not owned by anyone, it's impossible to do that, right? Like no one owns Jesus. Thus, anyone can come along and sort of tell a story with Jesus. They can tell their version of the Jesus story. And maybe it gets accepted, maybe it doesn't. If it's like some total nonsense, you're going to have to dumb. But like, if it's like more or less in line with like the generally accepted way of understanding the myth, then like it might get accepted, by a larger number of people. But no one can come along and say, "Oh no one else can tell this story."
Well, people
right?
certainly we certainly end up in internet debates as if people can, right? It's like that's that's
Yeah.
the
Yes.
doctrinal debates we refuse to go into on Mosaic Ark except to laugh at them,
Mhm.
right? Which is the sort of I know the doctrine and I'm going to, I mean, I do know the doctrine and I will tell you you're wrong, but it's the Rachel the feeling of possessiveness of the character is it's definitely something people that latch onto, or like if you say with John Carter in the movie and that property, and that's the way it was in the book, and it's not accurate in the movie, and people get upset because their sacred characters have
Yeah.
been
Their text has been dispersed.
yeah I mean
Yeah. Well, just look at just look at the reactions of what you used to be the reactions of fandom to the desecration of their favorite superheroes or fictional characters. Like that was very much a 2010s phenomenon, and I think like by this point, like people just stopped caring because they've tuned out Hollywood for the most part entirely.
They have.
Like you look what happened with like the Joker movie recently, and everyone was just like, shrug, don't care, right? Like, yeah, of course you did that. Like, which is actually, that's a sign of
it's creative suicide.
Well, it's not just creative suicide. It's they've taken all of the cultural capital they have and set it on fire.
Yes.
And no one. Yeah, no, they self-immolated, and like no one cares about them anymore. So that which means that their ability to influence the culture is now.
Yes, and they did. They dropped bombs on themselves. The movie bombed.
Yeah.
They're not able.
Yeah. All the
which I think
people liked this Joker, so we have to actually destroy him in their minds.
Which I think
the theory I read.
I think it's actually that's exactly what happened. Yeah, no, they're like, oh god, these incels like the Joker too much, so we have to show him getting raped in prison by a black dude, and totally.
Yeah,
it's like
did not see that. Not going to. Don't care.
I loved the first one. I know Rachel knows this because I've spoken about it. The Joker was an absolutely brilliant film, and they said they're going to do a sequel. Yeah. And people said, well, you don't need a sequel, and they're going to introduce Harley Quinn. And I thought, well, actually, I can see that. I'm really looking forward to seeing it. And then the first reviews came out the first day on Twitter. Like all these anonymous people and famous people were all complaining about it and said, here's your spoiler because screw you. That's what I'm thinking, right? And I'm like, I'm kind of glad they did that because I'm like, that just would have completely ruined the experience of watching the first film for me. So yeah, definitely won't be watching it. But
I think that phenomenon of Hollywood just completely ruining itself and destroying its ability to get people to buy into its own myths is intimately related to the collapse of the World War II myth that we're seeing sort of at the same time. It's it's part of this sort of general frustration with the current sociological order, which has led to a sort of critical mass of people already, as of several years ago, sort of starting to consciously reject the myths that were being manufactured by the 20th century myth makers, whether we're talking about the comic books or the movies or the historical narratives or the poems at the base of the Statue of Liberty. Like, the critical mass several years ago already, people being like, nope, we're not accepting that anymore. And then the reason that was a critical mass was that drove the myth makers on the other side absolutely insane. They were like, oh God, we can't have this many people blaspheming against this civic religion that we've carefully built up over the last century. So then they sort of lost their marbles. They got driven to unwise and hasty action. Actually quite similar, I think. This might be a controversial point, and like I might even be wrong about this, but I have the impression that like sort of during the Enlightenment period through the 19th century, you had sort of secularists going increasingly hard on the church authorities for like, things like, hey, your chronology doesn't make sense. And the response from the church authorities to these challenges, rather than being like, oh, that's a good point. Well, it was actually to sort of double down and become very hysterical and dogmatic. And that actually just
The
made them
syllabus
look
of
very
errors
silly.
is completely accurate. What are you talking about? It is. I mean, the Pope was right about a lot of the things that he was worried about. It's like seen into the 20th century. It was very good.
Probably.
Yeah.
And like, I hate to admit it, but like the people on the other side of this thing, like the 20th century myth makers may well turn out like, it could be that like, we culturally vanquish them. And then in 20 years, we're like, ooh, they were probably keeping us from having a really big war. And that big war really sucked.
Well, that's
like,
what their claim is, right? It's like that we need to do
that's what it
this,
is.
otherwise, horror descends again. And that is, I mean, that is a sacred claim because
Yes.
they're holding off the terror. And
They're holding back the demons.
it's only by
They're
way,
holding back the demons of the
right?
night.
It's only
Yes.
by way of our
Right.
protection that all of these other and we're sort of looking behind the corner. It's like, I don't see a demon there. I think you made it up.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Or sometimes it's more like, I see a demon there, but it's not as scary as you are.
Right.
Actually.
Right.
Yeah. He's a smaller
like I'd
one,
rather
you're the
deal with
bigger
that
one.
demon than what you've turned into. Like that's, yeah. Or some people are like, yeah, it's not even a demon. I think that might even be an angel back there. So like there's.
Yeah.
Well, so this is, I think
Yeah.
we're going to have to wrap this up and say to be continued as a sort of exercise. But I think getting back to John Carter as both the movie and the premise, what I noticed watching the movie, and I've read enough of the book to realize that the movie has, like, the bit with the dog is in the book. I was happy about that.
Yes.
That Carter Burroughs was writing, I mean, with experience on the frontier, but which was closing in his lifetime, right? It's like the 19th century Western. I mean, John Carter is clearly a 19th century Western on Mars, right? And therefore it's both a longing for a new frontier, which is where I think, it's like, where do myths come from? They clearly come from the edges,
Which he
right? They
exactly
come from the
yes.
frontier.
Yes.
But it's interesting that
Fear be dragons.
That's why we're in the Dragon Common Room.
Yeah.
That he goes to Mars and finds a collapsed civilization, right? The Martians, the green guys, what are they called? The Tharks. They're living in a city that was not built by them, right? And that has collapsed. But of course what Carter does, and I can understand why C.S. Lewis and Tolkien would have enjoyed him, because they're worried about these sort of frontier stories. I had not realized Burroughs was American. I thought he was English. And therefore, I thought what was going on in the movie was, this is an imaginary Africa, right? It's like Rider Haggard, right? And it's like you go into the frontier world and find this lost civilization with princesses and such, which are clearly modeled on that. But I mean, the problem for us, which I think we've sort of rounded around bound, is like a fallen city is much more mythical and romantic than one that's functioning and flourishing. Ironically, it's like the fallen empire is where all of the medieval stories inhabit, right? The fall of the Roman Empire. That, how do we get out of this without a fall? Right? It's I'm kind of worried now, because we can't sit around in our functioning cities and expect to have adventure anymore. And that's,
but our cities aren't functioning.
Okay, but it's like
they're not functioning.
The
So
myth feels dead
We're
because the
falling
adventure is
slower.
dead because we're not building it. It's like, wait a minute, this is
we already experience. I mean, people point this out all the time. If you look at street pictures from the 1950s
oh, we've
or
fallen
the 1930s,
already. Yes.
Yeah.
we
Absolutely.
are already in the dark age right now. Like, oh, we have technology, yay! Like they had technology in the dark age that preceded the Middle Ages as well. It was not so dark as all that. In fact, their weapons technology was, if anything, more advanced than what the Romans had.
Exactly. The Middle Ages weren't dark.
So,
we just don't have the stories written down. But yes, okay.
well, yeah, because I mean they lost due to. Well, this is a theory that I heard, which I've always thought was a pretty good one. Is that due to the rise of Islam, the Mediterranean became an Arab lake infested with Mediterranean pirates, thereby cutting off Europe from the supply of papyrus from Egypt, thereby eliminating the cheap paper that they used, which then led to a decline in literacy, because if you go from paper being dirt cheap to suddenly you're having to use vellum, which is extremely expensive, you just don't have the material ability for large numbers of people to own literary materials. So literacy gets restricted to a small number of intellectual elites, and you stop producing as many books because you're also more focused on just preserving what you already have, which is important, and passing that on rather than writing down your own thoughts, which are probably not as important as the ones that need to be copied.
So that's technically called the parenthesis. Yes,
Wow.
it's Henri Perren's Muhammad and Charlemagne. And it's such a great myth that it's driven early modern history for a century, debating it, right? The degree to which, in fact, everything gets shut down. But again, it's a great example of a premise that is incredibly productive because everybody's like, is it actually true? And the thing is, it is true and it isn't true. It's one of your ambiguities. Yeah. So it is true and it isn't true. If you want to come back, we'll talk about early medieval history.
Well, what he said, it reminds me of something that's going on right now. People are afraid that books are being
yes,
being edited from their old meaning.
Yes.
And so nobody wants digital copies. Everybody's collecting books if they can find old books or even old DVDs that haven't been post-purchase edited.
That's a good example.
Which happened to us. So I mean,
like
that
Kindles,
is
but even like the reprints of older books, like not even that old books. Like there was that infamous case where someone found all these changes had been made by sensitivity readers to Roald Dahl's work.
Oh yeah, and his estate, to their shame, I hope I'm not wrong about this, because then shame on me if I am, but I think they actually agreed to it.
His estate did. That's more intellectual property thing, ironically.
Yeah.
Rather than yes. I will not allow the reputation of the medieval scribes to be besmirched in this way. They were actually pretty accurate, all things considered.
Yeah. Well, they weren't. There was the occasional interpolation by enthusiastic monks who were like, "Ooh,
Lorenzo Valla has a lot to answer for. It was the donation of Constantine. It was the only thing they ever found, right? We clearly have more to talk about. So this is, I think we've proved our premise of how important it is to talk about mythology. And I think John Carter as the Burroughs story, and John Carter as the Substack author, I'm really looking forward to reading the rest of the John Carter and watching the movie again. And you all got to see the movie because it's actually much more brilliant than its reception. I mean, it's like its reception has let us all allowed to believe. And the thing that I found absolutely touching and wonderful about it is it's the way they scripted it. And I'm not sure this is in Burroughs. It's all about fathers and daughters. It's actually very sweet. Right. It's like every single one of the sort of the psychological tensions in the story is the father protecting his daughter. It's beautiful.
That's definitely
it's a lovely movie.
One amongst the many like little departures, that is a huge part of it.
Okay.
So
I liked it.
The book, the book is very much like a close third person perspective.
Yeah.
Like, you're following along the character John Carter through the whole book. He doesn't ever depart from him. So there's none of this going back and forth showing like, what Deja Thoris is up to before he arrives and in Helium, or, the fights happening between the different sides. None of that really.
I will say Helium is an absolutely stupid name for the city. That did not hold. We call it nitrogen. I mean,
he was. Say what you will about Edgar Rice Burroughs. He was terrible at things. You think that's bad? No, seriously. Like if you read like the Pellucidar books, which are so much fun. Like those are the Hollow Earth novels, which are an interesting counterpoint actually to the Mars books. But so they're a lot of fun. But his names, like there's a caveman named Gurk.
Oh gosh, yes, it did not have the Tolkien touch on the nomenclature. That's fair. Although with obviously John Carter, I mean it's JC, and he can leap around and he comes from another planet. I mean, it's a little obvious.
I don't know if that was intentional on his part, but like, yeah, it's like, like the savior comes from beyond the world to
Another dimension.
yeah.
So we do have this sort of conversation among the Drake poets about, you know, being able to write the incarnation is actually really a challenge, right? How do you make Christ in our reality either not the Gnostic, you know, mystical descent into materiality, or the deified man, right? The Aryan. So this tension between the Gnostic and the Aryan it's a big deal. And you know, I was impressed, at least with the movie. I thought they pulled it off nicely. So we're recommending the movie. Where can people find you, and what would we can put links to the articles that we've been talking about on your Substack, but
yeah,
do your advertisement
Substack,
for how we can find more of you.
Barsoon.substack.com is like the best place to find me generally. You know, I usually publish something once a week at least. Not always. I mean, when I was working on the essay that we were talking about for most of this, I think I didn't publish anything at all for like 6 weeks because I was just working on that. And I'm sadly active on Twitter. You can find me there at Martian Word Lord. It's word like WYRD. As in the Saxon word for fate. So
you're weird is what you're saying.
Yeah, but I'm pretty sure that the word is actually like closer to the original Saxon pronunciation.
Yeah, but
I looked it
weird
up a
is
while
what
ago.
comes from
Don't quote me on
it.
this.
You're a weird lord.
It is. Yes.
Weird
yes.
words.
Well, thank you.
The deliberate ambiguity there.
I really like the way you phrase that, right? That we are in, because that feel, it's the ambiguous rather than the binary, which I think is different. And that sitting with the multiple references, I mean, to me that sounds poetic, right? It's like the word can mean weird, it can mean fate, it can mean strange, it can mean speaking, right? And that this poetic ambiguity is hopeful. I think that's actually quite lovely and very beautiful. So thank you for joining us.
Yes.
And
thank you for having me.
And we have, I see Anaf Habib says salute to Sir John, if that's one of your friends. We've had Hey
Anaf.
Yeah, and I and Mel, thank you all very much for joining us. We're going to have a bit of a break on the Mosaic Ark. Our next stream will be in 2 weeks, and we'll have Captain Zodiac back with us talking more astrology. So look forward to having you.
Cool.
And John, we'll be very happy to have you back on once you figured it all out.
I would love to be back.
Okay. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.